Hello and welcome to Tech Deals. Ryzen 5 2600 build guide, $700 versus $1,000. How much should you spend? What budget is worth investing in such a system? And do you really get anything extra for 43% more money than a basic system? This is a follow-up video to a $1,000 Ryzen 5 2600 build guide that I did recently on my channel. Link in the description below. Beautiful system, great features, awesome RGB, great components. But one of the comments and criticisms that was left beneath that video and the follow-up videos I've done since is, man, for $1,000 you could get better hardware. Yes, you could. But you're going to give up things in the process, and that's what this video is all about. What do you get when you go from 700 to 1,000, or perhaps more appropriately, what do you lose if you take your $1,000 Ryzen 5 2600 build and start stripping out the unnecessary parts to get down to a $700 budget? Now let me first start off by saying that this video is not sponsored. The original build that I'm using in this video was, but that deal is over. So this video is all mine, so you're going to see some other products besides Gigabyte here. Gigabyte was nice enough to sponsor that build. Second of all the different items I'm going to talk about in this video, as well as several alternative suggestions along similar lines, will be linked down in the video description below to Amazon and Newegg. Those are affiliate links. They do support the channel. If you like this sort of deep dive analysis, if you like this sort of comparison where I go into the individual component choices deeply, please consider supporting by using those links when you shop. You can also support the channel by clicking the join button that is next to the subscribe button for $5 a month, at least in the US. Then you directly support the channel. You get a loyalty badge, custom emojis to use in chat, and my undying appreciation. You can also subscribe on Floatplane and join on Patreon or support via PayPal in links in the description below. With that out of the way, let's get on with the video. First things first, before we talk about individual components, I'm going to put two complete component lists here. Over here, we're going to have the $1,000 build, since that's where it's sitting. Over here, we're going to have the $700 build. You may immediately notice that many of the major components are the same. Ryzen 5 2600 6-core 12-thread processor, a B450 motherboard, 16 gigs of RAM, RX 580 8GB card. Wait a minute, you say. How in the world are these $300 apart when they basically have the same components? Good question, glad you asked. Not all parts are created equal. Well, of course, the Ryzen 5 is. The graphics cards are not the same. The RAM is not the same. The motherboard is definitely not the same. Everything's a little bit different, and everything has lost some features along the way, or at least especially the motherboard, the RAM has lost RGB, etc. So each of these items over here in the $1,000 build is going to lose something in the process of taking 30% out. It's like 43% going up, but it's 30% going down. Math, yay. But we're going to go through these items one at a time, starting at the top with the CPU, which doesn't change, but I'll talk about the 2600X briefly, and then we'll go down each of the components. Please understand, build guides are a starting point, not an absolute. You may be watching this video going, well, I prefer a GTX 1060 as opposed to an RX 580. I prefer MSI or Asus as opposed to Gigabyte. That's fine. It's your build, build it your way. This is meant to give you an idea of components that should work well together in their class. A $70 MSI motherboard, a $70 ASRock motherboard, and a $70 Gigabyte motherboard generally have about the same features. Same thing with power supplies. $30 power supplies tend to correlate. $70 power supplies tend to correlate. You can change brands from Gigabyte to EVGA to Corsair, and they pretty much follow along plus or minus $10 in that path. So if you prefer a different brand or want to customize it, by all means, that's the whole point of a custom build. Why don't you let me know what your favorite brands and favorite components are down in the comment section below. I don't reply to every comment, but I promise you I do read them all. The first item we'll talk about is the CPU. This is frankly one of the simplest things to discuss because it's absolutely identical in all respects between the two builds. Ryzen 5 2600, $160. This thing is an amazing value for the money. 6 cores, 12 threads. It has a base clock speed of 3.4, but that's meaningless. It has an all-core turbo speed of 3.7, and it will go up to 3.9 when you're not stressing all the cores and threads to their absolute max. In many gaming tests on the stock included cooler, the CPU comfortably ran at 3.8 gigahertz, Completely bone stock out of the box, no overclocking required. In fact, in my opinion, overclocking the CPU is pointless. Yeah, you can get maybe a little more out of it if you tinker with it, and if you put a bigger cooler on it, you might get another 100, maybe 200 megahertz out of it. But if you go to 4 gigahertz versus the 3.8 I was seeing in the game testing, that's a 5% clock speed difference. In the real world, that translates to nothing. That is not an overclock worth bothering with. It's not an overclock worth paying an extra $50 for fancy cooling on, and that leads me into the 2600X. Now, big disclaimer, prices change. Right now when I'm filming this video, the Ryzen 5 2600X is $50 more than the 2600. $160 to $210. There is no way in the world the 2600X is worth $210. That is crazy. If, however, when you watch this video, you check prices and they're only $20 apart, yes, by all means, buy the 2600X. It's totally worth $20 more. $30 is a maybe, not a penny more. It does come with a better cooler, but for what the chip is and the speeds it runs at, that's not a big deal. It's not RGB, it comes with the Wraith Spire, this comes with the Wraith Stealth, and it does have about 200 megahertz faster out of the box clock speeds. It'll run at 4 gigahertz on all the cores in gaming versus 3.8 on this, but it is such a minor difference. I'd pay $20 in the course of a system build, but I wouldn't pay any more than that. If you're going to spend $50 more, get a 2700. Speaking of coolers, neither one of these system builds has a customer aftermarket cooler. The very first video I did on the build video series of this, I talked about putting a 6 heat pipe direct contact dual fan RGB Cooler Master MA620p. My lord, that's a mouthful. Come on, Cooler Master, Hyper 212 RGB would have been just fine. And by the way, they've done that now. There is now a Hyper 212 RGB, although it's a 4 heat pipe. Very nice. I will have a review of that in a video soon. But that MA620p ended up not going in here because ultimately it's a $60 cooler, $50 on sale from time to time, and it does nothing except provide RGB. Now, if you want RGB in your system, by all means, get yourself a pretty RGB cooler and rock on. Just don't think that it's somehow magically going to provide enough performance to justify its price from a functional point of view. I have seen people post on Twitter, on the Tech Deals Discord. We do have a Discord linked in the description below where people have quite literally put 240 millimeter $100 liquid coolers on these Ryzen 5 2600s, and they're like, well, so I'll overclock and get better performance. Yeah, I guess, but Lord, what a waste of money. And if you've done that, well, I'm sorry, because this CPU plus the 240 millimeter liquid cooler would have absolutely bought you a Ryzen 7 2700. 8 cores, 16 threads, and the Wraith Spire RGB cooler included in the box. It's a much, much better deal. So, buy big fancy coolers for the top-end chips. If you're buying mid-range chips, I would skip them. Having said that, I would skip all aftermarket coolers for this, even the $20 and $30 coolers. This ran cool and quiet on the included stock cooler on every game that I've tested. I legitimately would not put anything but a stock cooler on a Ryzen 5. That brings us to our motherboard choice. Oh boy, this is a big one. There are, first of all, many motherboards to choose from. This is one of the best B450s on the market. I'm not going to claim it's the best. I haven't tested enough, but it's one of them. It's very well featured. It's got a ton of stuff on it. Very nice motherboard that I'd be happy to put into any mid-range system. And then you have the $60 motherboards that are half the price. Well, they're both B450s, they both allow overclocking, they both allow RAM and USB and all the other stuff. Why in the world would anybody spend $120 on a motherboard? Good question, glad you asked. Because you get Intel Gigabit Ethernet as opposed to Realtek Gigabit Ethernet. Do you care? Maybe, maybe not. Most people would agree the Intel chip is better. It costs more for sure, but it's more widely supported if you want to run alternative operating systems or just have better gaming support with lower latency. Realtek ALC 1220 audio versus Realtek ALC 800 series audio that's many, many years old at this point. Do you care? Well, if you have $20 speakers on your desk, probably not. If you have $150 headphones or $100 speakers, Maybe you do. It is better audio, better quality capacitors, better separation on the motherboard between the audio solution and the rest of the components for shielding purposes. It's not perfect. It's still inside your machine, but they do put better stuff on there on the better boards. Wi-Fi. This has a very nice AC Wi-Fi solution with external antenna. Those can cost anywhere between $20 to $30 on their own to get a decent one with a decent size antenna. That right there covers half the price difference between the cheap budget boards and this. RGB. Do you want RGB? Now, if you don't, this is a moot point, but if you do, this has a respectable amount on it and multiple RGB connectors on the board. USB and Sata ports. This has extra Sata ports. Many cheap B450 boards only have 4. This one has 6. That's nice. Extra USB ports. This has more USB ports on it, both internally and on the back, than on the budget boards. Now, I mentioned the VRM, the power delivery, earlier. No, this does not have a top-end power delivery solution, if you care. If you're running a Ryzen 7 2700X and you're putting a 280mm liquid cooler on it, well, Lord, you shouldn't be even having this conversation. You should be on a nice $150 to $200 X470 board with an 8 or 10-phase power delivery system. That's not this system. That's a $1,500 plus build. This is a $700 or $1,000 build. This is all that you need. There was no throttling, no temp issues whatsoever in running this chip. You wouldn't have it with the Ryzen 5 2600X either. We already talked about that. If you're going with a Ryzen 5, this really is fine. If you're going with a Ryzen 7, it's not. You can put a Ryzen 7 on a B450 and maybe a Ryzen 7 2700 non-X with the stock cooler would be fine. If you're going with a 2700X and you want aftermarket cooling because you're trying to build the best Ryzen system you can, get an X470. Do yourself a favor. Get something with a better power delivery and better everything if you're going that high. But for this, it's plenty. Having said all of that, let me turn that argument on its head and offer you a different point of view. This is the ASRock X470 Master SLI AC board. It is only $25 more expensive after mail-in rebate on the date of this filming than this beautiful B450 board. 12-phase power delivery. Well, 5 plus 1 doubled, but it's much, much better power delivery than this B450 does. Does the Ryzen 5 2600 care? No. Does the 2600X care? No. A 2700X overclocked might, but that's it. But that's not why you might want to consider this board. Well, it does support SLI because it's X470 and it's got the SLI chip on it, but that's a separate issue. The reason you might care is if you consider the Ryzen 5 2600 a 2-year chip. If you want to keep the Ryzen 5 2600 for 2 years, and then in 2 years from now when the Ryzen 7 4700 comes out, maybe with 12 cores, 24 threads, and you want a motherboard that's going to be able to handle power delivery to the top-end chip 2 years from now, then you're probably going to want a better motherboard because this probably will struggle with a 4700 or 4700X 2 years from now, which you'll be able to drop into either board, but it'll probably run better and faster on an X470 with a decent power delivery system. Please note, you give up a few things in this board. It's not all uphill. Better power delivery, SLI support, native support for 6 SATA ports. This has to have an add-on chip for it because it's X470, but Realtek ALC 800 series audio. It's still surround sound audio, it's still HD audio, but the audio solution on this B450 is superior. If you have better speakers, if you've got good headphones, this will produce better sound. Maybe you care, maybe you don't, but be aware that you actually have to go a step above this and spend more to get that feature. It does have Intel's LAN chip, which is really, really nice. It has a good dual antenna AC Wi-Fi solution, so that's good. Much better power delivery. It does not have as much RGB support. It's got a little bit of RGB support, but its RGB is not as extensive as the Aorus Gigabyte really does, the best RGB in the business. So if you're sitting here going, well, I don't care about the RGB and I don't really care about some of those other features, I just want a better board for future upgrades, I gotcha. That would be a great board. ASRock has some of the best power delivery in the business, much better than Asus does on many of their boards, better than, well, frankly, these. If you go up in the chain on Gigabyte and MSI in the $170 to $190 range, you can absolutely get 10-phase power, which will run very, very well on all the top-end chips. But $139 after mail-in rebate, that's a deal. That brings us to system RAM. System RAM is actually relatively straightforward. In the $1,000 system, we have this gorgeous RGB RAM with 2 dummy modules that will populate all 4 banks, giving us beautiful RGB, and it really, really works nice. They all light up, it all syncs together. Using the Aorus RGB Fusion software, you can sync it up to the motherboard, sync it up to the case, sync it up to the graphics card. It looks like $1,000,000. It's expensive. You're spending $100 more for this kit than a non-RGB kit would cost you. And that's quite a bit of premium for RGB. Now, if you want Christmas on your desk, if you want one of the most beautiful RAM kits that I've ever had the pleasure of using, it really is really gorgeous in person. The videos and pictures that you may have seen, the brief video I showed at the end of the build video doesn't do it justice. But $100 is $100. And for $120, $100 less than this, you can buy G.Skill Ripjaws 5 DDR4 3000 16 gigs. That's a lot less money for effectively the same performance RAM. So that's the RGB RAM part of it out of the way. Let's talk about RAM speed for a minute. Well, actually, before we talk about speed, let's talk about capacity. It's 16 gigabytes or 16 gigabytes. If you need 32, you need Ryzen 7, full stop. If you think you only need 8, you don't. You need 16. The price difference between 8 and 16 these days, it doesn't make any sense anymore. And frankly, if you really do only need 8, you probably don't need a Ryzen 5 2600. A Ryzen 3 2200G or maybe a Ryzen 5 2400G might be all that you need. But for a 6-core 12-thread chip, 16 gigs. Okay, so that's the capacity. Let's talk about speed. Ryzen by default will basically support any DDR4 2666 MHz RAM. That's the official JEDEC spec. That's the engineering spec that is standardized across the industry. Faster than 2666 is considered overclocked. 3000, 3200, 3600, theoretically they're all supported, and they will, to a point, work in this board, depending upon which RAM kit you buy, and who made the memory chips, and whether it's single rank or dual rank, some of which you don't know when you go out and buy the RAM. Now, each motherboard has a QVL, or qualified vendor list, that lists specific models of specific RAM from companies. And please note, you will find different model numbers. There are, for example, Ripjaws 5 with model number A and Ripjaws 5 from G.Skill with model number B. They look the same, they appear to be the same, they have the same specs, the same CL rating, but they're not the same memory chips, and so G.Skill has given them a different actual model name, that long 16 or 18 character thing that nobody ever pays attention to. Now, if that all sounds complicated, let me simplify it for you tremendously. DDR4 3000 is probably the safe sweet spot to be at. 3200 is nice, and 3200 will work for like 98% of users. If you have an updated BIOS in your motherboard, you have your processor, and you have a quality set of memory from a name brand manufacturer, today at the end of 2018, 3200 will work in most Ryzen boards with most Ryzen chips. Keep in mind, it's not 100% guaranteed because the memory controllers in the processor and every board and every RAM kit is a little bit different. So most, but not all, will work. I've had most RAM kits work. There have been a couple of isolated situations where it hasn't, mostly on the 300 series boards with first-gen chips. The 400 series boards and 2nd-gen chips have been much, much better. I even got DDR4 3600 to work on my 2700X, but that was on a $200 motherboard, so there you go. As far as RAM speed goes, 2666 is fine. If you find a deal on 2666, or if you already have some, by all means use it. Don't be afraid you're giving up a lot of performance. At this segment of the market, spending extra on high-speed RAM is the biggest waste of money ever. Is there a real performance difference in the real world between 2666 and 3200? No. Not on Ryzen 5 2600 or 2600X, not on anything you're doing with this CPU. Many times I've seen comments from people beneath my videos and over on Discord where people have said, well, I saw a benchmark here, or I saw a game test there that said that there was an 8% performance difference if you bought faster RAM. I'm sure you did, and I could easily show you benchmarks here that does the same thing, but those are isolated corner cases meant to tell a story. I'll give you two simple examples. Cinebench, DDR4 2666 CL16 standard speed, versus DDR4 3200 CL14 Samsung B-Die quality RAM expensive. Cinebench, there's no performance difference. Ryzen 7 2700X is going to be somewhere in the 1800 range regardless of what RAM you put on there. Let's change benchmarks to the 7-zip compression decompression built-in benchmark. I have seen differences in performance of upwards of 10% between really fast RAM and fairly slow RAM in 7-zip's compression decompression utility. So which benchmark I show you will go a long way to saying, yeah, there's no difference at all, who cares? And oh my goodness, you get 10% more performance if you just buy faster RAM. In my extensive experience with a lot of RAM kits and a lot of Ryzen systems, at this point I have 5 different Ryzen systems, including my test benches, that are actually up and running at the moment, ranging from a Ryzen 5 2400G all the way up to the 2700X. For the vast majority, 90+% of real-world situations, I could change your RAM out in your system and you'd never notice the difference. It is a trivial, minuscule, real-world difference so long as you're going with about 2666. 2133 is pretty slow, and I would skip that. I would avoid that. 2400 is okay, but 2666 is well supported, and anything from there on up is just fine. Beyond that, buy based on RAM and price. Solid-state drive choices. Yeah, we'll get to that. First of all, the Gigabyte UD Pro that's included. On the day I filmed this video, it had actually come down in price from when I filmed the very first video. It's $79 at the moment. 512 gigabytes of good, solid performance for $79 is a very reasonable price. It is not the least expensive drive on the market. And in the $700 machine, we've got a Team Group drive, 480 gigabytes. It's a little bit smaller, but frankly, the performance differences are pretty minor. This is probably slightly faster than the benchmarks, but it's a trivial difference. The Team Group drives are just fine. I've reviewed them. I've got one installed in something downstairs. I actually can't remember where it is. It's what happens when you have this many drives. But I use it. I had no problems with it, no complaints with it. As far as SSDs goes, as far as SATA SSDs, 2.5-inch or M.2 SSDs, I generally buy based on price once I've picked a name brand manufacturer that I'm happy with. Many people choose to go with Samsung or Crucial because they make very, very good drives. Intel, their 545 drive recently is a very good drive. And then, of course, you've got ADATA, who some people have a positive view of ADATA, some people have a negative view. I tend to have a positive view. They make a lot of drives. They're one of the largest serial ATA SATA drive makers in the world. And with some of their recent drives, especially the SX8200 I recently tested, very favorable performance compared to the Samsung 970 EVO. But those drives aren't really appropriate for this build. I mean, you could do NVMe, but I wouldn't. I wouldn't spend the money on NVMe when you're going mid-range graphics card, mid-range motherboard, mid-range CPU. Spend your money on a faster processor. Spend it on a faster graphics card. If you want performance, going from SATA to NVMe, in my opinion, only makes sense once you've already built a nice top-end system. Maybe $1,500, definitely $2,000 is the price point at where I think NVMe makes total sense. $1,000 or less, skip it and get SATA. Now, just for giggles and grins, I'm going to go through these one at a time and give you a brief heads up on my thoughts of these drives. This is the Intel 600P. It's largely discontinued at this point. It's not the new QLC 660. This is the old 600P. If you find one of these cheap, please skip it. It's a terrible drive. I do have a new 660p. It's actually not here. It's over at the new filming studio. But the initial benchmarks I see on it are very good. But it's NVMe, so I don't know that I'd buy it for this machine. This is a drive I'm not actually 100% sure that they make. Is this... How about I put this right up? The ADATA SU700. I did a video on this back in January of this year, and the 240 gig drive was $75. The SU650 480 gig drive is now $65. So wow, prices have dropped by like half in the past 11 months. That's awesome. Fine drive, nothing wrong with it. Not spectacular in any regard, not bad either. 960 EVO is actually what's in my main production machine. NVMe, inappropriate for this build. ADATA's SU900, it's actually their MLC drive. If you find one cheap, by all means. Not entirely sure they make these anymore, and if you find one for a high price, then definitely skip it. But if it's a good price comparable to the SU800, then by all means get it. I absolutely adore Crucial's drives. This is the box for an MX300. The MX500 is the current performance drive. Not a huge difference. The MX500 is going to be a bit faster. Interestingly enough, the Crucial MX series often benchmarks in Crystal Disk Mark near the bottom of the pack. But I have these drives in several machines, and I gotta tell you, they're some of the snappiest, most responsive drives I have. So benchmarks are a good starting place, but they can be deceiving. I would put a Crucial drive in anything. They're wonderful, wonderful drives. Western Digital Black. The blacks are NVMe, the Western Digital Blues are SATA. This is an M.2 drive, it's in my production machine, it's not appropriate for this build. Interestingly enough, it's the first SSD I've had problems with. It overheats. Now, I don't know if that's because it's a first-gen production. This is not the new revision model. I need to get the new revision and compare it to this and see if there's a temp difference between them. But this is one of the very, very first Western Digital Black NVMe drives, and it runs hotter than anything else in my production system. NVMe drive from ADATA. This is actually, I think, a discontinued one. Don't get NVMe. Same thing, discontinued drive. This might be the one exception when I say no NVMe. This is an SX6000. It's priced more like a SATA drive. It is not as fast as the high-end NVMe drive. It's about half the performance of, say, a Samsung 970 EVO. But it's double the performance of a SATA drive. If you find a SX6000 for about the same price or maybe $10, $15 more for the same capacity as a SATA drive, sure, absolutely. Easy install, M.2 drops right in the motherboard. It will be a bit faster and more responsive. It just has to cost pretty close to a SATA drive to make sense. SX8200, about the same performance as a 970 EVO, not appropriate for this build. 970 EVO, great drive, wrong for this build. I have absolutely no idea what Toshiba plans to do with the OCZ SSDs that they acquired. They rebranded them. This still has OCZ on it. This is the Trion 150. It's fine. OCZ went bankrupt for a reason. Toshiba's fine. I'm sure they've reworked it. I wouldn't bother. Sandisk Ssd Plus. Why does this still exist? This is still for sale new. This thing is old and slow and terrible. Please do not buy a Sandisk SSD Plus. I've had a couple of these pass through my hands, and I've kept this one only basically to tell you not to buy one. Sandisk Ultra 2. It's everything the SSD Plus isn't. Fast, responsive, dependable. I have several of these. In fact, my main scratch drive for storing the recorded video that you're watching right now, that I basically have bulk video for game capture footage, for recording this on my main production machine. I have 4 of these in a single Windows storage spaces array on my main production machine, providing me with 4 terabytes of SSD space. Great drive, no issue. I plan to use these for a long, long time. So if you find one of these on a deal, by all means. Please note, it's an older drive at this point, so it needs to be competitive in price because there are some faster options now. This drive needs a review. I've had this now for a while. I apologize, Kingston. This is their KC1000 NVMe drive. It's actually on one of my test benches. It'll get a review soon. Great, but not appropriate for this build. 760p from Intel NVMe. Great drive, wrong for this build. I said there were no duplicates in here. There technically aren't, although this is an SU800 M.2 drive. But it's a SATA serial ATA, not NVMe. I've got a 2.5-inch one down there buried in the pile. This is a common misconception that deserves an explainer video all on its own. M.2 is an interface, not a protocol. SATA is a protocol, not an interface. NVMe is a protocol, not an interface. You can have 2.5-inch NVMe drives. They plug in via U2 ports. You can have M.2 SATA drives. SATA and NVMe and M.2 versus 2.5 inch have nothing to do with each other. So this is a SATA drive that plugs into an M.2 slot. If you find a good deal on one, by all means, put it in here. Okay, I lied. It's another SX6000. Sorry. Who in the audience wants to guess what the real-world performance difference between an 850 EVO and an 860 EVO is? Yeah, basically nothing. So if you have an 850 EVO lying around, it's still one of the best SATA drives on the market. What was Samsung thinking? 750 EVO. This was out for what, 3 months before it just vanished from the market? Yeah, I bought one. At this point, it doesn't matter. For those of you curious, these boxes are empty. Most of these drives have all been used in builds, in giveaway machines, in systems somewhere in the machine down below. I keep these boxes for exactly this purpose, to be able to do videos just like this. Western Digital Blue, great drive, SATA. Now this happens to be an M.2 drive, but you can also get it in 2.5 inch. They're exact same drive, it's just the form factor that's different. Western Digital bought Sandisk, so all the good stuff about the Sandisk Ultra 2 applies to this. It's just a more, well, it's a slightly revised modern drive. It's pretty close to the Ultra 2. So Western Digital Blues are good. I mentioned they're empty boxes. This isn't here. This is the AdLink S20. I was genuinely impressed by how well the AdLinks performed. I still have 2 of these in 2 different systems. There's a video on my channel showing that. If the AdLink drives are cheap on a per gigabyte basis, on this sort of system, I would absolutely put one in. But for a company like AdLink that really is not a top-tier manufacturer, it has to be cheap on a per gigabyte basis. There's the SU800 2.5 inch drive that I mentioned. Random thought of the day. If you are not price sensitive and you want the best SATA drive on the market today, you want the 860 EVO. I guess the 860 Pro would technically be the best. That's for a very special customer, and if you're watching this video, you aren't that customer. The 860 EVO is the drive I would go to if I was not worried about the price. It's usually the most expensive drive, not always, by a couple of dollars, but it's a great, great drive. Best drive cloning software on the market. If you want to clone from a hard drive to an SSD, buy the Samsung, skip everything else. They do have the best cloning software, bar none. And last but most certainly not least, I just reviewed this drive. This is the SU650. It's their budget drive. It performs very well. This is actually installed in this machine. If you watch the build video, you saw this installed. World of Warships, World of Tanks, League of Legends, Fallout 76 Beta, Assassin's Creed Odyssey are installed on this drive. As I record this in this machine, they patched, they updated, I ran them, I benchmarked them. Could I tell a difference between this and most of the other SATA SSDs that I've used? No. And that leads me to the point on performance. I did this exercise for a reason. It's long, and I was debating as to whether to do it, but if I were to take your computer and randomly insert 5 of these drives, could you figure out which 5 I put in there? Possibly, if it was that SSD Plus from Sandisk. That drive really was bad, to be honest with you. That shouldn't even be in the pile anymore. But the only reason it's still in the pile is they still sell it new. Most of the rest of these drives, from the Samsung 860 EVO all the way down to the budget drives like the ADATA SU650 or the AdLink S20, if you're running games, if you open your Steam library and launch GTA 5, I challenge you to be able to tell which drive you're running it off of. The performance is that close. 10%, maybe 15% real world difference. But if you open GTA 5, you might find there's a 20-second time between when you click on story mode in the start menu and you actually get into the game. So a 10% difference would be 2 seconds. Maybe it's 18 seconds versus 20. Without a stopwatch or timer, could you tell the difference between a game load of 18 seconds versus 20? I would submit that most people can't, especially if you're not looking for it. I mean, sure, if you're sitting there staring at the screen going, 1, 2, 1, okay, fine. In my opinion, buy based on price with whichever brand you're comfortable with. If ADATA or AdLink, if you're fine with those, you're comfortable, great. If you're not, okay, buy a Crucial MX500, buy a Samsung, buy a Western Digital Blue, or perhaps an older Ultra 2 if you find one. I think I've killed the SSD horse, but essentially, price, size, performance last. After that ridiculously long SSD explanation, I'm going to keep the graphics card short and sweet. 1080p gaming, high to ultra detail, 60 to 100 frames per second, butter smooth performance, everything from PUBG to Fortnite to Far Cry 5 to Ghost Recon Wildlands to Assassin's Creed Odyssey, League of Legends, CSGO, World of Tanks, World of Warships, GTA 5, you name it, that RX 580 8GB runs it just fine. I didn't find anything that it didn't run just fine at 1080p. Now, you're not going to get ultra max detail at 100 frames per second and everything, but if you're willing to vary between high to ultra and 60 frames per second in AAA games is just fine by you, that is an awesome value choice. If you prefer NVIDIA, the comparable card would be the 6GB GTX 1060. Very similar performance, faster in some games, slower in others, depends upon what you play, but as far as I'm concerned, these two cards are interchangeable. In the past, I have advised buying the 3GB GTX 1060 or the 4GB RX 580. That was then. When these cards originally launched nearly 2.5 years ago, nothing needed that much VRAM. Over time, that has changed. Now, you can still get away with those cards. If you find a really good deal on one, sure, but the texture detail in games is going to be something you have to watch. You may, over the next year or two, be able to play at high detail, but you may have to set textures to medium because you're running out of VRAM. So you've gotten 1.5 years use out of 3GB cards. You've got maybe another 1.5 years use if you're flexible in the texture setting. But at this point, 6 and 8GB is the place to go. And the prices basically make the smaller cards pointless. Right now, in the $700 machine, 8GB RX 580s, brand new, are $209. You're not saving but $10 or $20 going to the 4GB card. There's no reason to buy, at the end of 2018, a 4GB graphics card over an 8 when it's $10 or $20 difference. That's crazy. Now, something you might consider is the RX 570, if it's cheap enough. There's about a 10% performance difference between the 570 and the 580. So if you find a 20 to 30% price difference, if the RX 570 is, say, an average of 25% less money, that's a deal. 10% less performance for 25% less money is not bad. If you're comparing 8 gigs to 8 gigs. If you're comparing a 4GB RX 570 to an 8GB 580, well, that's not apples to apples. There's no performance difference between 4 and 8GB cards on the AMD side, but there is on the NVIDIA side. 3GB cards are 10% slower than 6GB cards. They actually have fewer compute units on them. Get a 6GB card at this point. It is worth considering, if you don't mind used cards, GTX 1070s, which are 50% faster than either one of these, are currently trending about $250 on eBay, at least here in the US. That's a little bit more than the RX 580 8GB card, but it's about the same price as a brand new GTX 1060 6GB for 50% more performance and 8GB of VRAM. So if you don't mind a used card, possibly an X-mining card, that's worth considering. Otherwise, pick between these two cards for 1080p gaming and everything. Now, I say 1080p gaming. 1440p gaming, GTA 5, League of Legends, CSGO, World of Tanks, Rainbow Six Siege, and even games like PUBG and Fortnite will run at 1440p on either of these cards at slightly modified detail settings. Maybe ultra at 1080p, they'll have to be at high detail, maybe medium and, well, PUBG may be medium at 1440p, but they will do it. So if you want to do that, you certainly can. What I would not count on either of these cards for is 144 Hz gaming. But then again, if 144 Hz gaming is what you're looking for, Ryzen 5 2600 is probably not what you're after. Up to 100 frames per second is really these cards' specialty. That brings us to power supply. As configured at $1,000, we have a 750 watt, 80 plus gold, semi-modular, 5-year warranty power supply with all the bells and whistles. It was very nice to build with. It fit great in the system. The modular cables are easy to work with. The flat black cables are wonderful. It's nice. That being said, it's kind of expensive for this system build. Would I personally put this power supply into this system build? No. It's nice, but it's expensive. $30, 450 watt, 80 plus bronze from EVGA. Much more appropriate for this system build. 450 watts is absolutely plenty for the RX 580 and Ryzen 5 2600. It just doesn't necessarily have enough to crossfire a second card or to go to a Vega 64. It would handle a GTX 1070 just fine. I've done that. There's a video on my channel. In fact, I put a GTX 1070 and a 4-core, 4-thread i5 on a 400 watt, 80 plus white power supply, and it runs just fine. So 450 watts for this is absolutely plenty, considering the Ryzen 5 2600 is a 65 watt chip effect. Well, it goes above 65 watts, but it's not an issue. Black cable's 3-year power supply. It's not modular in any way, shape, or form. Everything's connected, but it's also $30. It is a tremendous value for the money. Nothing wrong with the higher efficiency 80 plus gold. It uses less electricity. There's less loss from the wall to the computer, but it's more than double the price. However, 750 watts does leave you room to drop in a second RX 580 in, well, I said Crossfire, SLI, to put in a Vega 64, to put in a 2080 Ti, one of the new RTX cards, to upgrade maybe in 2 years. Perhaps you go with the ASRock X470 I showed you earlier, and you're going to go to the Ryzen 7 4700X 2 years from now. Okay, fair enough. Yeah, then you would buy this power supply. But if you plan to keep the machine as configured, I don't want to say it's a waste, but it's kind of a waste. Buy something like this, save yourself $50, put it somewhere else in the system. Now, you can get equivalent versions of this from the other companies. The Corsair VS450, for example, it's not $30. I think it's closer to $40 at the moment. The price varies. But you can get roughly 450 watt 80 plus bronzes for somewhere between $30 and $40 from most of the companies. EVGA just happens to be the least expensive at the moment, and I have 2 of these, and they both work great. Last but certainly not least are case choices. There are about 1,050,000,050 case choices available on the market. I'm not even going to remotely attempt to cover them all. What I am going to do is talk to you about what you get between a $100 case and a $50 or $60 case. You can spend more, but at this price point, it makes no sense. If you're going with the Ryzen 5, anything more than $100 for a case is a bit excessive, but that's personal choice. You buy what you want. Now, this case is retailing for $100. It's currently on sale at the Amazon at the moment for $90, and you're going to find most Cooler Master cases, once they come out and have been out for a month or two, they tend to be on sale for $10 or $15, so $90 might be the ongoing price. I really genuinely like this case. If you watch the build video in this thing, it's so much easier to build in a slightly upgraded case. You have room behind the motherboard tray to actually run real cables. You have lots of tie-offs. You have lots of places to put drives. There's places to put drives in the back, in the front, in the trays. The power supply cover is nice. These 2 RGB fans in the front, the 200 millimeter fans, they are silent, they are bright, they are beautiful. This case comes with 2 front panels. The mesh is the default, but you can also put the acrylic if you want the clear plastic. I suspect most people will leave the mesh. It has a carrying handle on top. Way too many cases do not have carrying handles, and that is really nice. The tempered side glass is beautiful. I like the way it's just got the 2 screws on the top. You take those off, it tilts off, comes off on the rail. Mounting everything is nice. This was a true pleasure to build in. The price point's great. I would absolutely build in this again. Another case I want you to take a look at is the MB500, also from Cooler Master. It is an RGB case as well, but it's smaller than this is. It's a little bit thinner, a little bit shorter. It doesn't have all the features of this. The RGB fans in the front are smaller. It does have an RGB fan in the back, which is nice, but this does not have an RGB fan in the back, just the 2 in the front. It does not have a carrying handle. And after mail-in rebate, yes, mail-in rebates suck, it's $59. It's $30 if you count the mail-in rebate. The 90 here doesn't require it. It's $30 less expensive than this case. If you prefer the look of that or the look of something similar to the MB500, by all means, $50, $60. Corsair has their Spec series, which is nice, although it really isn't as large as these. It's more of a mini tower. They call it a mid tower, but it's not. NZXT has their S340 series, the S340 Elite with glass. It's very, very nice. You can find Phalanx cases, and Fractal Design has some very nice new cases out, but I haven't covered a lot of those, so I cannot talk about those in detail. Unfortunately, I've not been able to get Fractal Design or NZXT to return my emails, or you would see more of those on my channel. As soon as they do, I will, I promise. Thanks to Cooler Master for sending me all these, because it gets expensive after a while if you have to buy them. Would I spend the $30 to get this over the $60 MB500? Yes, I would. I've built in enough small cramped cases. I don't ever want to do it again. I like big cases. But that's me. That's a personal preference. Maybe you're space limited. Maybe you need something smaller. Actually, if you need something smaller, those Corsair Spec ones like the Spec 04, the Spec RGB might make more sense because they are narrower, shorter, and not as deep. And if you're in a space-confined situation, that makes sense. Ultimately, at the end of the day, cases are a trade-off between size and price and features and RGB. I really do like this case. It was a pleasure to build in, and please God, would all companies put carrying handles on these things. That is wonderful. I really did enjoy it. I wouldn't go cheaper than $50. When you start buying cases under $50, you start to shed everything. Because keep in mind that there's shipping and warehousing, and the Amazon or Newegg has to make money, and everybody sort of has to touch it along the way. So if you buy a case at $30, how much money did they spend making it? $5? $10? You just, some of those are just really cheap and they kind of fall off on the value equation. So to me, $50 is sort of the entry level. $100 is sort of the most I'd spend on a Ryzen 5 2600 based system. And anything in there, depending upon size and features, is what I would be looking at from any of the major manufacturers. And beyond that, frankly, it's largely personal preference. Thank you all so much for watching this entire video. If you are still here, a super big shout out to you. I know a lot of people don't completely watch these long videos, but I do make them for you because I know that my dedicated fans love them, and I appreciate that. Like this video if you like it, share it with your friends if you loved it. Remember to subscribe to my channel with that big, huge red button directly below. Hit the bell notification icon next to it to actually get notifications. Please consider hitting the join button that may be next to the subscribe button to support this channel directly. All of that money comes directly to us, minus a very small cut to YouTube, and it gets you a loyalty badge, custom emojis to use in chat below, and, as I said before, my appreciation. It will help us with our new filming studio, hire an editor, and make more and better edited versions of these videos, because when I hire an editor, we'll make these videos more interesting. You can also find links to Floatplane, Patreon, and PayPal down in the video description below, and those are also great ways to support. You can also support by using the links in the video description to buy from Amazon or Newegg or eBay in certain situations all of the items shown in this video or any of my videos. Those are affiliate links. They do support the channel at no extra cost to you. Please consider using those when shopping. You'll also find links to Twitter, Twitch, Discord, and a couple of other things down there as well. Please check out the description. Leave your comments, thoughts, feedback, suggestions, ideas, queries, posers, or just random musings down in the comment section below. I do not respond to everybody, but I promise you I do read every comment left. Thank you so much for watching this video. I will see you next time.